My name's Alex Lockwood. I've been an Android developer for around 7 years or so. You may have seen me. I don't go to many conferences up until recently, but you may have seen me around Stack Overflow or blogging. I have a blog, Android Design Patterns. You may have stumbled across it over time. So the slides are available right now if you want to follow along, j.mp/pathmorph, and then I've also posted them on Twitter at AlexJLockwood. So today I want to talk about an animation technique called pathmorphing. And when I think of pathmorphing, I think of these as kind of the classic examples. There's the Pocket Cast app on the left and the Timely Alarm Clock app on the right. And as you can see, unlike the typical animations like animating, rotation, or translation, or color, pathmorphing is kind of unique in that it's actually animating the object's shape. And it's kind of difficult to wrap your mind around how it actually works at first. I remember when I first learned how it works, it was kind of like a mind-blown moment. Like, I had absolutely no idea how to even go about creating one. But hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll have a better idea. So pathmorphing isn't just specific to Android. It's actually much more common on the web. It's only been made available recently using vector drawables and animated vector drawables on Android. This is from an NPR article. This is being rendered in Chrome, and it's built using SVGs and a JavaScript library called D3. There's been some litigation with regards to the court districts in North Carolina. And I guess pathmorphing is being used in this way to kind of add time as the third dimension, try to like illustrate the transition between the before and after states. Again, this is being rendered in Chrome. You could technically write this in animated vector drawables for Android as well, though. So before I go any further, I kind of want to just give a basic explanation of how pathmorphing works. Before you can animate an object's shape, you have to understand how to draw it. And to do that, we use something called the SVG path data spec. You can think of it kind of as a virtual pen floating on top of a canvas, issuing a sequence of commands. So the first one is just move to this coordinate, and then draw a line to that one, draw another line, another one, and another one. And that's pretty much it. There's also, the SVG path data spec is pretty large. There are other commands like T's and C's to draw curves and arcs. In this talk, I'm only going to mention M, which is move to, L, which is line to, and curve, which is like a cubic Bezier curve command. If you wanted to morph that square that we just drew, we would use an object animator, which we'd declare an XML. This is animating a square into another square. It's animating the path data property of a vector drawable. And the obvious question here is, an object animator is responsible for generating the in-between states of an animation. So what is the in-between, like how does this object animator generate those in-between states? Like if you're animating from 0 to 10, it'd be obvious, right? You just go like 0, 1/2, 1, blah, blah, blah. But what's halfway between these two like seemingly arbitrary sequences of strings? And to answer that, what we can do is we can line them up vertically and kind of just go one by one and ask the question, what's halfway between these 2 points? In this case, it's 12.3. You can keep going through each command, keep finding the point that's halfway between the start and end point, and what you'll end up with is just another SVG path data string. It should be clear from this slide, though, that one of the requirements here is that both the start and end SVG path have to have the same number and same types of commands, right? Like in this case, it's MLLLL, and same thing in the end state. So here's a more visual example of what that exact object animator was doing. And if you run the animation, you see it's just kind of translating the square from one side to the other. But what's really happening here is the object animator is creating, tons of intermediate states, and on each frame, it's creating a new SVG path string and redrawing it. And together, those SVG path strings all combined into one give the illusion of this continued movement. We start to run into more trouble, though, if we were to animate a square into an octagon, right? Because now we have these, we have 4 points on the left, 8 on the right. So we have these 4 lonely points that, what does the object animator do with these? If you tried to morph it, it would look kind of like this, where it animates the first 4 points, but then it doesn't know what to do with the red ones. They just kind of pop into existence, and you get this really ugly animation. But actually what happens really, in Android at least, is it'll just crash the app. It'll just say, I think you made a mistake. There are an unequal number of commands in these 2 paths, so I don't understand what you're trying to do. So to fix this, we have to introduce our friend the undercover octagon. And what I mean by this is we can transform that square into an octagon by adding what we call dummy points. So this square still looks like a square to the viewer, but from the computer's perspective, it's a totally different shape. It's an octagon with 8 sides, and it will understand how to morph between those 2 states. And this strategy of adding dummy points is it's going to be really important in order to generate these path morphing animations, because it's not often that you have 2 shapes with the same number of points. It's kind of a chance thing. So we've been talking about lines up until now, but what about curves? Well, we can kind of think of it the same way if we draw the handles for the curves. These are cubic Bezier curves. Each cubic Bezier curve has 2 endpoints and 2 control points. And once you draw it like this, you can kind of apply the same logic, right? You're just drawing, just translating the points to their new location. On each new frame, you get the new location of those points, use them to redraw some intermediate state, and you get this continuous movement. You run into trouble, though, if you try to convert a line into a curve. For one, you only have 2 points on the left, 4 points on the right, but also you have this L command on the left and a C command on the right. So the object animator isn't going to know what to do. It's not going to know whether it should use an L or a C, and hence probably why the framework just crashes your app immediately. Like, it's not even going to try to morph these because it doesn't understand how to do it. But what you can do is, I guess you can call this kind of the undercover curve. It's a line that looks like, or it's a curve that looks like a line, but its control points have been placed on the line, on the same line that connects the endpoints. And when you do that, it's a cubic Bezier curve that just looks like a line. And now you can get this kind of smooth animation that looks like this. Taking that a step further, what if you wanted to animate an octagon into a circle? Well, you have 8 lines on the right, or on the left, 8 curves on the right. If you convert all of those into cubic Bezier curves that still look like lines, but are secretly curves under the surface, you can get something really smooth like this. And this is essentially kind of how path morphing works under the hood. Not at all obvious, but it works pretty nicely. But there is actually a second problem we have to solve, and that is that the order of the points matters. It's not enough to crash the app. It's not going to give you an exception, but it can really hugely impact what the animation will look like. And to give an example, if you go back to the squared octagon example, you see you have the number 1 point in the top, and they're both clockwise. But now let's say your design tool, or whatever you're using, like Sketch or whatever, exported your octagon like this, where the 1 is in the top right, now you're going to get something that looks like this. It's probably not what you wanted, right? Even worse is when you have the orders of the points reversed. So in the first one, you have a clockwise order of points, second one counterclockwise, and now you're going to get something really ugly that kind of like inverts in on itself. So again, it's not enough to crash your app, but this is going to be a deal breaker. You need to have the points ordered in a way that makes sense for your animation. So to recap everything I just said, Android puts a requirement on us to provide paths that we call are compatible with each other. They have to have the same number and same type drawing commands. You can use tricks to overcome this by adding dummy points and by converting lines into curves. And the order of the path points matters a lot. It won't crash your app, but it will affect what your morph looks like. So to kind of explain how I even became interested in this topic, it kind of all started when I wrote a blog post on icon animations last year. It's called An Introduction on Icon Animations. It was kind of inspired. It was inspired by a talk by Nick Butcher, who gave a talk called Animatable, I think at droidcon 2016, and basically it just goes through all of the techniques that come with animating icons. And I was really proud of this blog post because it took me like two months to write it or something like that, on and off. I wrote all these interactive demos that explained like how each animation type works. I was really happy to publish it, but it was also kind of bittersweet because I felt like I was basically saying like, hey, you should write these animated icons, they're awesome. Knowing kind of in the back of my head that like these are really hard to write, like especially the path morphing animations, because I had to do all this crazy like, redrawing the SVG paths, like doing all this crazy like cosine, sine math to like figure out how to split up curves and stuff like that. And around the same time, Nick Butcher also wrote a blog post explaining how he came up with how he built this path morphing animation from scratch. And we got together and kind of agreed that like this was way too hard, and we were writing SVG path strings like animals and doing all this math that like didn't seem necessary. So we got together, and what we kind of agreed on was that the main issue here was with the tooling, that design tools don't expose a way to like manipulate the order of points. Like Sketch isn't going to provide you with a way to like shift points over, because all Sketch cares about is what does the shape look like. It doesn't care about what order the points are in. It's also really difficult to overlap points on top of each other, which is kind of common when you're creating path morphing animations. Like if you wanted to add dummy points on top of some other point in a shape, Sketch won't let you do that. You'll get something like it'll have to be like really, really close, but not exactly on top of it. And it was also really hard to visualize what the morph would look like. And what we'd ended up having to do is we'd have to write some path string by hand and then like compile it into the app, and like click through the app and get to the screen where we want to run the animation and then look at it. And that was a really slow process for us. Like we wanted a way to just like see immediately like what is this thing going to look like? Is it going to look okay, or am I just like wasting my time? So what we did was we kind of thought like, what if there was a tool that could create dummy points, convert those lines into curves to make the paths compatible, reorder points, whether it's like reversing the order or shifting them, and then just immediately export to SVG, vector drawable, or AVD. And this is where the idea of Shapeshifter was born, a web app that was kind of specifically designed, that I designed to specifically solve these problems. And I want to give an example of kind of how to use this tool. This is what I'm going to show here is how to create a plus to minus path morph. So you see I've imported the SVGs. I just dragged them into the window. I'm creating a path data tween. I'm going to copy the minus SVG path into that 2 value, and you can see it's telling me that the minus and plus paths aren't compatible. The minus has 4 points, the path has 12, or the plus has 12, so it's not going to understand how to do it. It's also suggesting that I use this thing called autofix, which we'll get to later, which is going to magically try to fix everything. But I'm going to talk about that later on in the talk. So I copied that in. I'm going to click on this little edit path morphing animation button, and it's going to take me into this screen. And what it's telling me is that, just what I said earlier, that the plus has 12 points, the minus has 4, so they're not compatible with each other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this icon up here, and I'm going to add just 8 dummy points randomly. And once I do that, it should become blue again, and that means that the app will no longer crash when I try to run this animation. As you can see, it doesn't mean that the animation is going to look great. It's going to look pretty bad. And the reason why is because the order of the points, right? You have the 1 is in the top left for the minus, and the 1 is in the bottom right for the plus. And now I need to shift them over, and I get something like this. You can see the animation still looks pretty crappy, and that's because the order of the points needs to be reversed. The minus is counterclockwise, and the plus is clockwise. So there's a button up there that will reverse the order of the points for you. And it looks a little less crappy, still looks kind of crappy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move around those orange points into a location where I think the animation will look better. And that just happens to be right where I'm placing them right now. So once I run the animation now, it'll look much nicer. So that was plus to minus, but what about something more complicated like a arrow to an overflow icon? I say it's more complicated because the arrow is one shape, the overflow icon is 3. So how do you do that? How do you morph one shape into 3? And the answer is, what you can do is you can split the arrow up into 3 shapes. The design tool you're using is probably going to export it as 1, but we can use this split subpaths button up there to sort of tell Shapeshifter where do I want these paths to be sliced up. And once I draw those lines, I can say I can use the pair subpaths tool, which will allow me to be like, hey, I want these 2 shapes to morph together, and then these 2, and then these 2. Once I do that, it's going to tell me that the paths aren't compatible because the arrow subpath, the middle one, has 7 points, and the overflow has 4. So I need to add 3 dummy points. And once I do that, I get something that looks like this, which is kind of along the lines of what I wanted. Just to be a little fancy, I'm going to add a group layer, and I'm going to add some rotation just to kind of distract the eye from the morph itself. Once I find that adding rotation to path morphing animations can really make it look a lot nicer. So I have that path morphing tween on the bottom. I'm going to make a rotation tween. Click there, say go from 0 to 360, and when I play it, it'll look like that. Looks great. That's exactly what I wanted. This is what it looks like when you export to AVD. It also exports to SVG sprite sheet right now, which is a common format on the web. I've gotten feature requests for body movement, so you can use it with body, which I think would be a good idea. Also, CSS keyframes is another common format. And this is all available at shapeshifter.design, so I encourage you to check it out. There's also a link at the end of the slides. So here are kind of some examples that I created. As I was kind of creating the tool, like one of the things that I would do to debug this was I would kind of just like pick random icons and like try to find the best morph between them. And I guess these are kind of like the best ones I think I came up with. They're all pretty simple though, and when I tried to do something like this, I could do it. These shapes though have like hundreds of points, and it was really annoying. I had to like drag all these orange points all around, all over the place. Shapeshifter was great for morphing icons that were like, like 10 to 20 points or whatever. But in this case, the hippo or something had like 100 or something like that. The elephant had 50, so I had to add 50 points to the elephant and then like sort of guess like where should I put the points. And that wasn't great. So what I kind of had an idea, what if there was something called autofix that tried to automate the creation of path morphing animations? This stuff exists. It existed before Shapeshifter. It exists on the web. One of the reasons, though, why me and Nick came up with the idea with Shapeshifter was because those tools, they attempted to like automate these things for you 100%, but there was like always that like 20% chance that like the automation didn't generate something you wanted, and you were just kind of like stuck with it. And that was annoying enough that like it kind of turned us off to the idea of automating these animations. But kind of what I thought after I created Shapeshifter was, what if there was something that could like try to guess like where to put the dummy points or whatever, try to guess the best place to put them, and then if the result wasn't exactly what I wanted, I could just like move them around or whatever, and it would still save me a bunch of time. So I kind of took a crack at this. The first key assumption I made was that the morph that looks the best was often the one that involved the least amount of traveling. So like you can see the first one looks pretty awful because it's kind of like traveling all the way across the canvas to get where it needs to go, and it's resulting in this weird inverted animation type thing. The one on the far right is much better because it's just simply like 8 points are just staying exactly, no, actually 12 points are just staying exactly where they were, and then you're just moving 4 points down. So using that idea, I came up with like a kind of naive approach to generating these. Step one is to just add dummy points. Adding more seemed to give better results just because it reduced, I guess, the variation of, it reduced the chance that you have like 2 points that are like traveling really far to get where they need to go. The second step is pick a starting point. You can see it's kind of like evaluating every possible orientation of the points in that star, and trying to like find which orientation results in the least amount of traveling, and then you morph it. And this worked pretty well in actually a lot of cases. Here's kind of an example where I'm just like morphing random things into like a circle and then back into a hippo and doing all this, I don't know, crazy stuff. The purple ones are the points that were originally there to start with, and then the green ones are the ones that are the dummy points that are being added for the purposes of animation. The pros of this were that it looked pretty good most of the time, and it was also a pretty simple algorithm. You're just adding dummy points, just like calculating like the sum of all the distances and then picking the one that was best. But there are also some cons, mainly that there are a ton of dummy points being added, like way more than is probably necessary. And for Android, this may not be as much of, this isn't really as big of a deal on the web, but for Android, AVDs currently have to be compiled into your app. You can't create them at runtime, so the longer these strings are, the more you're like devoting to the APK size. There's also the runtime cost of like parsing huge strings and drawing like tons of commands. And recently I learned that there's actually a lint warning in Android Studio that it'll tell you if your paths are longer than 800 characters. So I didn't want to like start advocating that you should create lint warnings or whatever. And also it also kind of defeated the purpose of autofix. My original intention was to make Shapeshifter easier to use, but you're adding all these dummy points, so it's kind of like it kind of just got me back where I started. Like I had to, if it didn't result in something I liked, I had to like delete like 100 points and then like figure out some better way to do it. So I went back to the drawing board, and I remembered something from college called Needleman-Wunsch algorithm, which is a dynamic programming algorithm that's used in molecular biology to align DNA sequences. And I know it sounds random, but there's a connection, I promise. So these are two DNA sequences. You can see that they're different, but a scientist might want to know how similar are these DNA sequences. And if you run this through the algorithm, it'll give you something like this, an alignment between the two. So if these DNA belong to two different species of animals, this would tell you like how similar are they? Like, are they related? Maybe this would say like, oh, at some point along evolution or whatever, the DNA like for that first one had like 3 like nucleotides sliced out of it, and then maybe an A mutated into a C or something like that. There are also extensions to this algorithm that scientists often use to give preference to certain pairings. So like, for example, it's more likely for a T to mutate into a C than it is an A or a G. So you can say like, oh, I want to prefer alignments with pairings of like C and T instead of pairings of C and A, for example. But back to path morphing, I kind of took this idea and thought like, what if I did the same thing with SVG paths? What if I took these 2 sequences of commands and ran it through the algorithm? Then I could get something like this. The gaps in the alignment are the places where I want to put dummy points, and then any pairing that doesn't match up, I can just convert it, right? I can convert the L into a C that looks like a line, but it's really a curve. I use those extensions that I mentioned to give preference to pairings where the commands were closer together. So like you see, like for example, if you had like MLLL and you aligned it with MLLL, it wouldn't give you any information. But if you used that extension to say like, oh, I want to prefer L's that are close together rather than far away, suddenly it helps a lot with the alignment. So the result was pretty awesome, and it was to be honest, like I didn't even really expect this to work when I tried it, but it was really nice. Like one of the thing I liked most about it is that it is really aware of certain areas where points are necessary. So like in the hippo, you see the ear has, it needs a lot of detail in order to draw it. Whereas in the elephant, when you morph into it, it originally just had like a straight, like a single curve through the trunk. And what this algorithm allowed you to do is say like, oh, I need to add a ton of dummy points right in that area where the hippo's ear is. And in other locations, like in the back where the hippo and the elephant both have like, similar curves or whatever, it doesn't add a ton of unnecessary points all over the place. The downside is that this algorithm is like an ON squared algorithm, not just ON like before, but I figured since Shapeshifter is a compile time tool, it's not going to affect the runtime performance of the app or whatever, so I thought it was great. So up until now, we've been talking about just single shape morphs. But what if you try to morph a donut into a star instead of just a circle? Before we morphed the outer outline of that circle into a star, but what do we do with that inner part, right? Like, what do we do with that? And kind of the obvious answer to me at first was just, create this dummy subpath in the star. You can see right there that point is really actually like points stacked up on top of each other. It's just like MLLLL to the same exact location. And since it's just a point, it's not going to show up to the user at all. And you get a morph that looks like this. And this works really nice, especially with paths that contain holes, because you can just kind of like, it looks like the points are getting like sucked into a black hole, and it's a really nice effect. You can also do it with cases like this, where if you wanted to morph Texas into Hawaii, Hawaii is made up of 8 islands. You can see the effect doesn't look great here, but it actually does work in a lot of cases. And you can use that trick to kind of like rotate the icon during the morph, and it kind of like distracts you away from it anyway. In this case, though, it doesn't look great. And you could use Shapeshifter to split up Texas, like I did with the arrow, but then I obviously had to try, automating the creation of those shapes. And this didn't actually make it to Shapeshifter yet, but I think it's pretty cool. I stumbled across it's common in computer graphics. GPUs tend to only like to draw triangles, so there are algorithms out there that split up shapes into a ton of triangles, so you can send them to the GPU, and then the GPU will draw them to like draw cool 3D meshes and stuff like that. So I there's a 3-step process. First is just triangulate the entire shape, and you're left with way too many triangles, but that's okay, because the next step is to pick a triangle and morph it with merge it with a neighbor, and repeat until you have the number of shapes you want. So this is kind of like 99 triangles of beer or something. And when you have those 8 shapes, you're left with something like this. You can assign the shapes to each Hawaiian island based on like distance or whatever, and you get something that looks really nice like this. Here's kind of like a totally gratuitous example of what you can do with this algorithm. Again, I didn't add this to Shapeshifter just because I didn't feel like it was perfect. This algorithm tends to kind of like create these like long slivers, especially you can see like with the elephant. And I figured like it's not that hard to just use Shapeshifter to like slice it up the way you want anyway. But I don't know, who knows? Maybe at some point I'll come up with something better. So that is kind of as far as I got with Shapeshifter up until now. I wanted to end this talk just talking about what I've been working on in the meantime, and the first, by far the most popular feature request is the idea that you can like use Shapeshifter to draw stuff. So this is what I was working on for a while before I started preparing this talk. You kind of like, all the functionality that you'd see in Sketch. I'm using a library called Paper.js. It's really cool. I don't know if you've heard of it, but you can like draw, you can drag, Bezier curve handles. You can use a pencil to draw random shapes. You can then scale that and then rotate it if you want, and it gives you those like nice smart snapping guides and whatever. I'm drawing a random shape using a pen tool, I guess, here. And then also the ability to like zoom in on the canvas or whatever. Not in Shapeshifter yet, but hopefully someday. It's actually kind of a lot of work to write something like this. I was like working on it like for 2 months before I started preparing this talk. And in terms of like what I see for the future of Shapeshifter, I kind of like go back to the beginning of like what, like, I think like before any of this started, I tried to use After Effects, Adobe After Effects, in order to create an icon animation, which is like, it's a thing people use. But Adobe After Effects is like this huge, massive program. Like icon animations are probably the simplest thing that you can possibly create with After Effects. You can also like do all this crazy VFX stuff. After Effects also requires you to know like Photoshop and Illustrator, or like if you wanted to use Sketch and like import Sketch stuff into After Effects, you like have to install some plugin or something like that. And as someone who didn't come from a design background at all, like I didn't even know how to use After Effects or Sketch or anything. What I really wanted at the time was a tool that was free, simple, and just like had only the stuff that I needed to do in order to create an icon animation. Like I didn't need any of this, you know, this whole panel with like effects and preset stuff, and it just made it like way too hard to learn. So that is kind of what I see for Shapeshifter's future. These are the links to Shapeshifter. It's a completely open source. I've set up an open collective account for Shapeshifter if you want to like donate or whatever, because right now it's only me pretty much. I mentioned like Nick and I worked together on this. He doesn't really like web development, he tells me. So he's kind of just like, he gives me great ideas and stuff. And he was very inspiring in the creation of this tool. But yeah, I'm hoping to use these funds or whatever to hire like another web developer, because to be honest, I'm kind of like a newbie at web. I was doing Android for like 6 years before that, and then I just kind of got thrown into this JavaScript world, which is kind of crazy. So yeah, special thanks to these guys because they have been really awesome. Nick Butcher and Roman Nurek, who both work at Google. Nick, I've been talking to him for like a year and a half about icon animation, and it's been awesome. Roman taught me, like he kind of inspired me to start working on Shapeshifter because he's kind of known in the Android community for creating like web apps and dev tools and stuff. So he taught me a lot. And then Noah Veltman, I've never met him. He wrote that North Carolina illustration I showed earlier. He formerly worked at like some news organization in New York, and now he's at Netflix. But I got a lot of ideas from him from a path morphing library he wrote called Flubber. It's a JavaScript library. And I highly recommend you watch his talk called Pulling a Polygon Out of a Hat. It's on YouTube. It's an even more in-depth look into path morphing than what I just did, and highly recommend it. So link to the slides are on my Twitter at LXJLockwood, and thank you.